Hello and welcome. My name is Mike Langlois, and this is the Playful Subversions podcast. If we haven't met before, my name is Mike, and I am a psychodynamically oriented psychotherapist. I blog on Substack and teach on the interface between psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, emerging technologies, and video games. But tonight, I'm going to be starting a new podcast series. This is the inaugural episode, and our guest Carter will be joining us in a few minutes. And I'm really excited that he will be. But before we get started, I wanted to give you a bit of a background on why I was doing this podcast series and what I hope you'll be able to take away from it. So about a year and a half ago, like many of you, I found myself feeling increasingly overwhelmed and fatigued by the onslaught of authoritarianism and fascism, which had become brazen. It had become extremely overt as opposed to the semi-covert oppression that has been going on previous to that. And what I noticed was that in talking with patients and in talking with colleagues, a large number of us were feeling extremely fatigued and disoriented, which is, surprise, surprise, how fascism often works with people. And there was this urge that I and many of my colleagues and patients and friends felt to either turn away because it was just too exhausting and disorienting, or to become riveted in a way that was in and of itself immobilizing and wasn't really going to help us resist any sort of political upheaval. And so what I wanted to find was a third avenue, an avenue where we could experience some replenishment and rejuvenation, to reclaim some sense of vitality, and in short, to bring the seriousness of play to bear on resisting this particular moment in history, which is so extreme and can feel so dire. Now, I'm not alone in thinking there is a pathway to resistance that has to do with play and creativity, and I don't want to claim to be the originator of that idea. So I wanted to share with you a bit of reading from D.W. Winnicott, one of the psychoanalytic thinkers from the British Object Relations School. Winnicott has really paved the way for many of us in psychodynamic theory to understand play. But he also has a lot to say about creativity and compliance. Here's one of the things that he said. In chapter 5 of Playing in Reality, Winnicott wrote, "It is creative apperception more than anything else that makes the individual feel that life is worth living. Contrasted with this is a relationship to external reality, which is one of compliance. The world in its details being recognized, but only as something to be fitted in with or demanding adaptation. Compliance carries with it a sense of futility for the individual and is associated with the idea that nothing matters and that life is not worth living. In a tantalizing way, many individuals have experienced just enough of creative living to recognize that for most of the time they are living uncreatively, as if caught up in the creativity of someone else or of a machine. This second way of living in the world is recognized as illness in psychiatric terms. In some way or other, our theory includes a belief that living creatively is a healthy state and that compliance is a sick basis for life." When I read that, I was reminded of psychoanalysis's power for creativity and vitality, and how important it is that we seek out these ways of finding creativity, of playfulness and vitality, and how we can find them as a way of combating compliance. our psychoanalytic theory, our psychotherapeutic task is to resist compliance to find creative solutions. Play is what psychoanalysis has to offer, and play is very serious business. And with that, I had found my way back into what I think is important and meaningful about the work we do in psychotherapy, and some hope that we could find ways to subvert what is happening right now in the world around us with creativity and playfulness. Over the next several weeks, we are going to have hopefully fun together. I'm going to be introducing you to trampolinists, to rescuers of birds, to gamers, to farmers, and to people that like moving heavy objects for no apparent reason, as well as some other people. Each week we're going to talk about and talk with a psychotherapist who is either a psychoanalyst or a psychodynamic psychotherapist, or a social worker or a human service professional that has managed to find a way to do something playful and quirky that helps them replenish their lives so that they can go back to doing the work. And it is my hope in doing this that you will be inspired to find ways that you can bring some quirkiness and playfulness back into your work and life so that you can replenish yourself, because we're in this for a long haul. So without further ado, I want to start our first podcast by introducing our first person that's going to be joining us, Carter. You want to share your pronouns, or do you want me to share them?
Sure. Oh yeah, I'm doing they them. That's
Okay.
that's what we're running over here.
All right. So they them pronouns is what we're running.
21st century.
So Carter sent me a bio, and I'm going to read it, but I'm probably going to also add a couple things, because the bio you sent me is Carter is, among other things, the author of Larder, Ardour, a column about food and much else besides in the Ashfield News, an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. And that doesn't nearly do Carter justice. They are a community organizer. They are a psychotherapist. I don't know if you'd call yourself a psychoanalyst at this point, because
I do, just to make some other people upset.
Carter is actively dismantling the Psychoanalytic Institute, and we love it. But I wanted people to know that all of those things were part of Carter's repertoire, even though we're not going to talk about some of that perhaps explicitly, because the reason I invited you to join the podcast, Carter, was to talk about something else, which is, in this case, Larder, Ardour. And so we're probably going to talk about writing and creativity. I did just in the introduction talk a little bit about Winnicott and the importance of creativity as an antidote to compliance. But you're going to be the lived example, and you're going to talk with us about the quirky things that you do to help you do all this other stuff. And so part of why I introduced you that way was so that people could be like, whoa, this person is really doing a lot of serious shit. I want to be able to resist. How can I possibly do it? And Carter's going to talk with us about how they actually do this in a subversive and playful way. And so we're going to talk a little about Larder, Ardour with Carter, which is perhaps the most wonderfully written and alliterative title for a newspaper column. But we're also
Didn't want to let me do it, and I said I'm not doing it if you don't let me call it that.
Let's start there. So why didn't they want to let you do that?
My recollection is that they weren't 100% that people would know what Ardour was, which I thought was a little condescending. They were very nice people. They were trying to be thoughtful. It wasn't a malign thing.
Right.
But I was pretty adamant that people could look Ardour up in the dictionary if they weren't positive on it.
Right. And that's kind of it's metaphoric, isn't it? We don't want people to hear about Ardour because it may be too difficult to understand.
Paging Dr. Freud. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh. So there are so many different good columns that you wrote. And there's at least two that I want to make sure we get to, including, and I do want to warn people, we will have an explicit rating when this hits the podcast and Spotify and stuff, but we are going to swear because we can't talk about Fuckface the Rooster without swearing. More about Fuckface in a minute. But Carter, maybe you could start us off by telling us what made you want to write a newspaper column on food?
Totally. Well, I'm going to give you some embarrassing backstory on me, which is that I was doing that in like elementary and middle school at creative arts summer camp. That like the little kind of creative arts camp that I went to when I was a kid had a camper newspaper, and I had a recipe column in the camp newspaper. So this is not my first rodeo. That was a yen that I've had for some time. But the way it shook out was that. So you mentioned that I do a lot of kind of clinical and political work, all of which is pretty depressing in various ways, if necessary. But it became clear to me over time that like it was too hard and too nerve-wracking for me to do the kind of work that I was doing, and also live in a city where I felt kind of trapped in various ways. Trapped economically in the sense that I couldn't actually afford to live there. Like I was priced out of the city that I grew up in. But also, the more I learned about food systems and climate change, it just felt like a level of precarity that I wasn't super prepared to sign up for. Not to say that, climate change doesn't spare anybody, but the thing about living in a place where you actually have land is that you can you can do better at providing for more of your own needs when it's otherwise hard to do. I think we saw that in the pandemic in a pretty intense way. So in 17, my wife Ayala and I started looking to buy a farm, and then that took a couple years in turn to pull off. And then the farm that we found was this 32-acre former dairy farm, kind of roughly in the Berkshires, in Massachusetts. And it took so long to close on this place for complicated agricultural deed restriction reasons that by the time we closed, it was the week of lockdown and COVID. So we weren't running away from COVID per se, but it shook out that way. So we landed in this town where we didn't know a soul of the 1,600-ish people who live here. And we were trapped in the house doing nothing but basically cooking and like looking at each other. And our local newspaper, I came to discover, was this like really extraordinary thing. Like we have an all volunteer monthly newspaper that's actually written for and edited by like real newspaper reporters from other outlets in Western Mass. It's printed at the same press where they print the Berkshire Eagle, which is a great American newspaper. And this fantastic little monthly newspaper had everything you could imagine, except that it didn't have any recipes. So I, in a fit of hubristic fervor, cold emailed the folks who were in charge of this thing, and I was like, "Hey, would you consider letting me do this?"
You saw
and I sent
need.
them or I saw an opportunity for me to do something that I would find edifying at other people's expense. And so I sort of cold pitched myself. They said, yeah. And then I've been, doing that every month for nearly 5 years now. So it's me and my, readership of 1,600 people in Ashfield, Massachusetts.
And I think that when you talk about the city you grew up in, you're talking about Brookline. Am I right?
Yeah, I grew up in kind of Boston, Cambridge, Brookline,
Okay.
surrounding environs. Yeah.
Because you actually mentioned that in one of your articles. You refer to it as Baruchline.
Borough line, yeah, was what we called it when I was growing up. Yeah.
And you mentioned in that one of them, I think you were talking about your first slow dancing was at bar mitzvahs.
Yeah.
But I'm mentioning that because I'm associating to that partly because you've really been doing a lot of work helping folks understand the importance of really understanding anti-Semitism in a different way. And I
Hmm.
don't want us to maybe get too sidetracked by that, but I think it's
Sure.
important that in one of your articles, you really kind of spend some time writing your bona fides as someone that
Mm.
is Jewish. And
Yeah.
what was that like to write that particular one?
That one got a lot of attention. That one got me on the local talk radio, for better or
Oh,
worse. Um, it, you know, I, I'm an academic, so I spend an awful lot of time flinging my ideas into the ether with no idea if any human being will ever lay eyes on them. And there's a certain kind of freedom that comes with that. Um, that I don't have to like, I don't live with my audience for that kind of stuff, right? But when you live in a really really small town, as virtually one of the only people of color in the town, because I'm multiracial, multi-religious, multi everything, um, you're it's advisable to be aware of like how what you say is going to land, and it's pretty easy to imagine because you know who it's landing on. Um, and so I wasn't unduly worried about writing what I wrote, and we can talk more about kind of what that entailed. Partly because I knew that the community here is um, really very sympathetic to the plight of Palestinian people, which is what I was writing about immediately after October 7th.
mhm.
Um, but the thing for me is like uh, every you could kind of argue that politics reduces down to being about who gets food, and all food is irreducibly political. you know and interestingly, this is not what I was writing about, but Israel is sort of a fascinating case for that, right? Because part of the way in which a narrative is advanced about uh, to make the Israeli state out to be a much older project than it actually is by appropriating the foods of different communities that previously lived in that place before that state was established there, and then deciding to call that Israeli food.
Mm.
So the idea that like hummus or things like that are Israeli per se, or falafel, like that's Israeli food. It is the food of Israel, right? And that's the food that people eat in that place. But the idea of calling it like from there is itself sort of part of the project, right? Of establishing this as just like an ontologically essentially legitimate thing. By the way, you could say the exact same thing about American food, and I eagerly would. Um, so the a lot of what I find myself writing about is sort of at this intersection of food and politics, and I have an audience that is generally really receptive to that because a lot of them are farmers or their neighbors are farmers, and so they understand that intimately. And they're people who tend to really care about foodways and being you know fair and pleasurable in all things related to eating.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I felt very fortunate that it's been very rare that people have given me a hard time about anything I've written, which is not because I have never written anything worth giving me a hard time about, but it's generally gone over pretty well.
Do you think that the fact that you end with a recipe it has something to do with that?
I think it makes it a lot easier for people to imagine me as like a human being, right?
Uh-huh.
Which again isn't hard here because everybody like sees me 4 times a week, right?
Mhm.
At school pickup or the farmer's market or the hardware store. But, we all, we're all on top of each other constantly here. Um, but I do think that like I haven't I've only rarely like I've never done more than gesture at this in any of the columns I've written, but like uh, cooking is an activity that kind of gives me the mental space to mull over things that are troubling me.
Mm.
And I think that that's something that's evident across a lot of the stuff that I've written. And so in the column you're alluding to that I wrote right after October 7th, basically I was writing about the experience of um, my family ethnic racial heritage is really complicated, and that comes out, as you can imagine, in the work. But one important branch of that is that my maternal grandmother is Jewish, and suffered for that a lot in her life. And so I grew up in basically the most Jewish environs possible, right? That like Brookline, Massachusetts, which we all call Brookline, Massachusetts, is like one of the most, culturally Jewish communities in the world. The neighborhood I used to live in is called Little Israel. And so I grew up in an environment where actually like every white person was Jewish, basically. Like it was weird to me that there were white people who went to church. Um, and so the, you know, I grew up in that milieu, and the kind of sights and sounds and tastes of that milieu are like really live in a deep place for me emotionally. Like that's, you know, the food of that, you know, community that I'm partly a part of is really dear to me. Um, and to such an extent that every Thanksgiving I make this stuffing with stuff that I would get at the kosher grocery store near my old apartment. That's like it's actually not what I make is in and of itself not kosher because I don't keep kosher. But it's this stuffing made of challah with schmaltz, like rendered chicken fat, and you make these things called gribenes, which are basically like really, really, really intensely caramelized onions that you cook down on all this schmaltz and with like this like dark chicken stock. So the whole thing like it's a stuffing that tastes like chicken soup and deli food
Mm-hmm.
that I've been making since I was like 12 years old that I made up. Um, and so to make that, you know, really, really Ashkenazi Jewish dish on Thanksgiving, which is a holiday in which Americans have to think about the fact that we colonized this place and still are, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, which, is, I think for a lot of people, um, really helped them understand that Israel is a colonial society, just like ours. Not just like I don't want to be reductive, but very much like ours. Um, that it was all swirling in the food already.
Mm.
The contradictions, tensions, affinities, like they're just kind of semiotically attached to that dish for me. So to think about teaching people how to make that is, necessarily to think about uh, asking people to consider the same dilemma that I was mulling over, which is like, how do you how do you deal with the moral burden that's placed on you by being a colonizer somewhere, which is a moral burden that is, very alive for me.
Well, and there's something in the way you were just, well, two things. One is I just couldn't help but notice when you were describing this dish, the aliveness coming out, right? Like
Yeah.
there's just an increase of energy, an increase of bodily movement. There's something about food that's exciting, right? And there's something also about those recipes that I think is subversive. Like I think and I guess this was one of the other things I was thinking about with your recipes is that recipes are sort of an invitation, right?
Oh yeah.
Right? And an invitation is so, in some ways the opposite of colonizing. It's you're inviting people into
Yeah.
trying these things.
That's the hope, right? And I think it's also what, a lot of what I'm doing is also like paying attention to how people all over the world make the most of what they have as a really useful lesson. So I think that there's a way in which like, you know, there's a kind of liberal discourse. I'm critiquing this from the left. Everyone should understand. There's a kind of liberal discourse within the food world about what is and is not cultural appropriation, which I think is like a really legitimate area of concern, particularly for the writers who often like, we know that writers of color don't get valued or taken as seriously or wind up receiving the same opportunities, even though they're the ones who are inspiring these kinds of culinary trends that then white people tend to capitalize on. But I think that there's a way in which the correct level of scrutiny that gets can then lead people to be really anxious about like what they cook in their own house, which I think is crazy.
Mm.
The learning to cook is a way that you deal with your environment, right? And all of us, you know, we're seeing the effects of climate change so increasingly loudly. Like we recognize we've got to learn to deal with our environment and its limitations a lot differently. But like that's not a new problem for most people in most of the world. It's just that those kinds of foodways and that knowledge like, aren't necessarily widely or evenly distributed. And part of what I feel lucky that I get to do is like read really widely and eat fairly ravenously, frankly, and then show people what I'm learning, not with an idea that it belongs to me, but that you know, I'm learning from it,
Hmm.
and finding it really valuable in my life. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's an invitation for sure, and it's also like uh, it it's autobiographical, right? In a weird way, because particularly the way that I tend to write, I spent a lot of my uh, youth kind of queer, infatuated with Nigella Lawson, the way that maybe an older generation of queer person would have been into Bette Midler or Cher. And so, when you read or like listen to Nigella Lawson, which I hope that people have or will, um, she's just telling you what she did. She's not telling you what to do for the most part, right? She's narrating. She's narrating something that she did. And there's something really, I think, sweet about being led into somebody else's world in that way, in that kind of intimate sphere.
Hmm.
That certainly for me feels really nice to be able to do, given that as a professional therapist, I have to spend a lot of time uh, reluctantly guarding the details of my personal life.
Mm.
Not that I'm eager to do that. Like, I'm not one of these analysts who thinks that that's like, the most important thing to do. But, you know, therapy is a domain where your personhood always takes second place.
Mm.
And so being able to write in a way that like lets people imagine me in my house mulling things over and trying things and kind of like, you know, struggling and then having occasional victories, like it's sort of it's psychologically gratifying for me, however else it is for them.
Have you ever had a patient tell you that they read Larder Ardour?
And I don't think I've had a patient tell me. I've had some patients subscribe to my Substack, and then we've had to have conversations about that.
Mm.
But the bigger thing that happens is my students read it, my undergrads, which is hilarious. And so I've had students come in and be like, "We made the cupcakes," you know. So that's very adorable, and I get a wicked kick out of that.
What cupcakes? I don't think I read that one.
I didn't send you that one because it was sort of not on the like politics food theme, but basically I make these really slutty strawberry cupcakes
Okay, talk about the
where
slutty cupcakes.
okay, so the slutty cupcake situation is that I have a I have an affliction where when things are in season, I cannot resist the psychological impulse to buy 20 pounds of them. And then I have small children, so I like never have the ability to deal with that in any kind of, like really reasonable way. So right now I have 30 pounds of tomatoes sitting on top of my wood stove in the kitchen and I don't know what I'm going to do. But so I get like flats of strawberries and then they almost immediately start to rot. And so what I sort of figured out was, oh, you can if you don't have it in you to like make jam, which is really hard, you could just blitz a ton of strawberries in a blender and then cook them down by 50% in a pan with nothing added, and then make a paste that you can freeze that you can then use to like kind of add strawberry to anything. So I made these cupcakes that are like a where some share of the batter uses the strawberry puree for the liquid, and then that puree plus freeze-dried strawberry powder goes in this cream cheese frosting that honestly I could just I just eat it with my fists like a bear. Like it's so outrageously delicious. And it's not like there's very very little in the way of like technical skill. It just like cream cheese is an all-time excellent food. And so I write about basically developing a kind of para-addictive relationship with the frosting, where I would begin to get really anxious if I didn't have any in the house. So I would sort of like hoard it in the freezer, like in bulk, just for just in case.
And then then your students had read this and they made the cupcakes.
Yeah, I forget if I probably made some coy allusion to it because I'll like tease them with things about my personal life and be like, you
Uh-huh.
could try to find out. But then they made the cupcakes and they approved.
Oh, they sound amazing. And you know what? God, Now I'm hungry. I did not
I
before
know.
this podcast. I did not eat dinner.
Oh, tragedy.
No, I know it's true. There's some shrimp waiting to be poached in butter for me when I get finished.
Yeah,
Yeah.
living life right on the island.
Well, that's the
Yeah.
thing is when you're living out here, you've got to do that, right? And I'm glad you brought this one up, even if it wasn't overtly political, because the idea that someone might listen to this podcast and if they get nothing else out of it than the urge to go out and bulk buy strawberries or like make cupcakes, that's a win,
Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah. Well, and it, like I have generally found in life that productive things unfold when I make a problem for myself, and then I have to kind of tie myself to the mast to fix it. So like, yeah, it's not like even if you don't garden, like I'll be so real with you. I'm not an amazing gardener. I grow things that make me feel like I am, but that's none of that. There's no skill in any of that stuff that I do. We mostly, on the farm, we raise beef cattle. So that's kind of the primary thing we're up to. And then the garden is kind of an incidental. But like, even if you don't garden, like, it, most people have a farmer's market. If you live, within about an hour and a half of any kind of urban center, you've got farmers markets, and there are people there who like are dying to sell you stuff in bulk at a discount because they find it difficult to move through everything they generate. And so food waste isn't just a problem in the industrial system. Like the kind of patchwork way that our food system is organized makes everybody kind of in danger of wasting. So to buy in bulk and then sort of force your own hand, it's a really nice thing to do for the farmers who, almost any of them, in my experience, or would be very happy to text with you and arrange a bulk order, even if they don't bring it all. But it also then like, it just feels like an abundant thing, like to feel stocked up is a really fabulous feeling, that I'm sure is deep in my, Portuguese, Afghan, Jewish DNA somewhere. But like, yeah, knowing that you're squared away. I think we all had that during COVID, right? Like we were acutely aware of like, oh God, I'm really not squared away.
Right.
Like, what the hell am I gonna do?
So this is fascinating because I am a European shopper. But what I do is I like go every night. So, okay, we'll talk since we're talking about this.
Yeah.
I'll confess.
I'm about to be so jealous of you.
Well, don't be, because I live on Nantucket, which you'd think is an amazing, wonderful thing. But honestly, all the food that we have is largely brought over on trucks to the Stop and Shop. And when they put the trucks on the boat, all these refrigerated trucks, they have to turn them off. And so all of the food, the refrigeration goes off for 2 hours and 15 minutes, and then it goes back on again. And so there's a good number of times where I will be looking forward to something, and it'll be moldy if it's been more than a couple of days that I bought it.
That had never occurred to me.
No, it's so what I've learned to do is, and so fortunately for everybody, I'm a misanthrope. And the super Stop and Shop here is open till midnight. So every night around 10 o'clock or 10:30, I get in my car, and I drive there, and it's me and the guys doing inventory. Like the pallets, they don't even try to move things out of my way. So like I feel like I kind of belong there. But
You're a known quantity.
I'm a known quantity, and I basically buy stuff for the next day or the next 2 days. So this idea of stocking up just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Well,
and when you live on an island and most people have small houses and like don't and have little kitchens, like it's funny, you and I have actually the opposite dilemma because I live on a mountain 45 minutes from a grocery store.
Yep.
And so part of the reason the column was called Larder is because I have to like store a ton of food in my house for practical purposes because among other things, I am 37 and have two small children, and so I have to work 80 hours a week.
Yep.
And so, I have to just have a huge amount of stuff around.
Yep.
And that became more true, when we started raising the beef cattle because we have to keep hundreds of pounds of meat in the house at any one time in chest freezers. So, I have an incredibly outrageous pantry, and I am inveterately guilty of letting vegetables rot.
Oh God. Okay,
I know,
so
and I get guilt. Yeah, so it's like the chickens help because I feed stuff to the chickens, but it's not the best.
I have no basement. All right, I have no basement. I have a
Lucky you.
fridge and a cat and a galley. Well, I mean, maybe
Yeah.
it seems lucky, but like my fantasy would be to have a freezer that I could
Hmm.
put all this frozen meat in, and I can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, I think we're sort of talking about context, and everybody's food and cooking and shopping is a reflection of their environment. Um, let's before we get too far away from this,
Yeah.
let's talk about Fuckface the
Let's
Rooster.
totally do that. I would love to do that. He was a son of a bitch. Just while we're, taking advantage of the explicit rating.
Yes, go for it.
So, th- this is a very COVID story, right? We bought this working farm with really, really limited prior experience in agriculture, right? To even call it prior experience is a little generous. Um, and so we were trying to get started um, when essentially everybody was buying out the local farm supply. So actually trying to like get your legs under you doing farming when like all of the goods spiked in price by like fourfold
Mm.
because everybody needed them for their yards was a production. But fortunately, I had the presence of mind to order like 40 chickens and 40 ducks. Um, way before we closed on the house because I knew that you got to buy that stuff far in advance. So we bought this house and then like 6 weeks later, 40 chicks and 40 ducklings arrived. The ducklings I raised in this clawfoot bathtub that's over here, and I still have PTSD about it. It was the most disgusting thing I've ever done. And then the chickens, with the chicks we raised in the mud room in an old stock tank, no less revolting. Um, so when you order chickens, there's a couple of different. You can order them by sex, which is only about 90% accurate, or you can order what's called straight run, which is where like they just grab them it's probably going to be roughly 50-50 sex wise. So we had ordered a bunch of chickens straight run. So we had all these boys, a certain number of whom, we dispatched as meat birds early on in that first season. But then you kind of want to have a rooster, because it helps reduce the aggression amongst hens. And so, which is again not a parallel for human relations, but that's how chickens are.
Okay.
And so the, you know, we didn't really think very intentionally about which one we were going to keep because we didn't really have a strong basis for like assessing it. And so the one we kept turned out to be this guy that we would go on to name Fuckface because he was a horrible person, who was horrid with the hens, but he really, really hated me with tremendous intensity. And so, every time that I would walk in the coop, this guy would be like, you know, flying for my eyeballs, out for blood. And it devolved into this like I'm worried that somebody's going to call like the animal cruelty on me because like we would just get I don't know how to describe it, but we would just get in physical fights, right?
How do you get into a physical fight with a rooster?
Well, he would start it. I hasten to add,
I'm
but
not
like
judging. I'm just
no, no, no. I was not the instigator as far as I'm aware. Although at a certain point I was going in with a bad attitude because I had gotten attacked so many times. But he would just like fly at my face, and then I'd have to kind of slap him off, and then we'd just be in a slap fight where he was like flying at my head with the wings, and then I was trying to slap him away. And it was just like really, I want to say it was beneath my dignity, but I don't think that there's much beneath my dignity. I mean, or so I learned in that case. And so, I had this sort of ethical dilemma with Fuckface because it was like, well, you're a bad rooster, and I really avidly want to murder you and eat you, but also like your badness is probably at least partly my fault, like as a being that is under my care. And like, what are the ethical implications? Not just of like, I'm not even really getting into the ethical implications of killing any animal at all, which to me is sort of a separate conversation. But the ethical implications of like, okay, well, like I made you bad, and then I have to live with it, and like, how cool is it really for me to then like, and also how, you know, to what degree am I animated by like a vengeful impulse more than a practical one? because it sounds again, it's making me sound totally crazy to talk about feeling like you want to seek vengeance on an animal. I think anyone who's ever had a bad rooster probably knows this feeling. Um, but yeah, so he wound up as Coco Vin, fuckface Auvin.
What was the what pushed you over the edge? What was the moment where you decided it was time for him to go?
So the when we decided that he had to go, was that he attacked my wife when she was holding the baby.
Oh,
So that was the like, okay, that was you're sentenced to death. But then I was kind of like dallying because I was, I had killed animals before. That wasn't actually new for me, and I hunted and stuff. But I was just feeling ambivalent about the whole thing. But then he attacked me one more time, and he got me in the ear really good, and then I got enraged, and then I murdered him immediately.
so this is probably a fitting time. We won't call it a memorial or a tribute, but could
Yeah.
you share your recipe for fuckface coq au vin?
Oh, absolutely. Um, and I might make a minor modification on the fly because there's actually a way that I like to do this slightly differently. So I'll
Okay.
quote with amendments. So, fuckface au vin. One rooster carefully plucked, singe as needed because they get pin hairs in them that you can like hold their feet over the burner on your stove if it's a gas burner, and you can burn those off. Quarter pound of bacon ends, roughly chopped. Two yellow onions, thickly sliced. Two large carrots peeled. One leek cleaned. Half a pound of shiitake mushrooms quartered with stems reserved. 4 to 5 cloves of garlic minced. 8 shallots halved or one bag frozen pearl onions. 3 tablespoons tomato paste. And I say 3/4 of a bottle of red wine, but I'm going to encourage you to substitute 3/4 of a bottle, about 500 milliliters of cider instead, like hard cider. I personally think it's better. Um, Rooster stock, 1/4 as needed. See below. 3 tablespoons Armagnac brandy, 3 bay leaves, red wine vinegar to taste, or cider vinegar, olive oil and/or butter, salt and pepper. And then this is a 2-day project. So day one, gut rooster, then butcher into drumsticks, thighs, breasts, wings, necks, and feet. Neck, singular, I should say, and feet. Scrub the feet with a stiff brush if it has been running around outside. Transfer everything but neck and feet to a dish, salt lightly, pour over cider, cover, marinate overnight. 2. Prepare rooster stock. Preheat oven to 400 degrees. Place carcass, neck, feet, heart, and gizzard on the sheet pan with 1 carrot, 1 onion, leek, and mushroom stems. Do not use the liver here. It will make the stock incredibly bitter. Um, Salt and oil lightly, roast for 45 minutes, then transfer contents of sheet pan to stock pot, barely cover with cold water, and cook over low heat for 4 to 6 hours. My shortcut would be I use a pressure cooker for 2 hours on high pressure, and this will make way more stock than you need, and it freezes perfectly. On day two, you will cook your bacon in a large, heavy Dutch oven until crisp. You set the bacon aside and then separate the fat. Remove the rooster from the marinade, but reserve the marinade. Pat the rooster dry, salt and pepper it heavily. You want a lot of pepper. Then brown it in batches in a generous amount of bacon fat. You set the browned rooster aside, at which point you'll saute mushrooms in bacon fat, set those aside, and then saute your shallots or pearl onions in the bacon fat and set aside. And you can supplement with oil or butter depending on what you need. You'll then preheat the oven to 275, and in your Dutch oven, you want to saute 1 onion in bacon fat until it's graham cracker brown, which takes at least 20 minutes. Then you'll add garlic and tomato paste, cook that for 1 minute just to kind of darken the paste. Deglaze that with the Armagnac brandy. Be careful not to burn your eyebrows off. Um, Add the rooster back in, except the breast portions, which hold off because they go tough. Then the wine and the bay leaves, and then you add stock just to barely cover all that, and then put a lid on it. And here's the tricky part: is that roosters vary very widely in how long they need to cook compared to other proteins people might get from the grocery store. So you should cook this covered in the low oven until the thigh bone wiggles easily, which could take 4 to 5 hours, 4 or 5 hours, maybe more for a free-ranging rooster. Fuckface took 6. And you should check the rooster for doneness roughly every hour after the first 2 hours because they vary so much. And once the rooster seems to have an hour or less to go, you add your reserved mushrooms, those shallots or pearl onions, and the rooster breasts, and you want to cook all that in the oven uncovered until the rooster is done, because then you get evaporative browning on the top of your stew. I cannot recommend to you highly enough. Um, if you make a stew with the lid on, cook it, or even a tomato sauce, cook it uncovered in the oven for the last half hour and get the benefit of all that browning on the surface. So transfer your Dutch oven to your stove, remove all those Rooster portions, and you're probably going to need to boil down the braising liquid until it coats the back of a spoon, which is called nappe in French, but you don't need to care about that. And then you'll season the braising liquid as needed with a little bit of vinegar, because otherwise it tastes kind of flat. And then you'll return the Rooster and the bacon bits, and then you serve, perhaps with an egg noodle for 1970s nostalgia.
So,
Ben,
do you get hungry when you write or read this stuff? Because I was feeling like I was going on a journey.
I eat so much of my own cooking that I mostly get hungry when I'm thinking about like restaurant food.
Mm-hmm.
I also, I have two little kids now, and so I try to like figure out something interesting enough to write about once a month, but then for the most part, we're cooking for 2-year-old and 4-year-old, which is nothing to write home about for the most part. My post-COVID habit since leaving the city is I look at the Google Maps listing for restaurants that I used to like and look at the pictures people post of the food. Which is grim. It's a depressing way to spend an evening, but I confess to doing that.
And I don't know if you were a fan of Reuben's Delicatessen in Brookline.
I was a Zoftig's girl. I was a Barry's Deli girl. I was very, very into S&S in Cambridge. Reuben's was never my particular, but I understand.
It's so much better. I mean, Zoftig's has gone downhill, but Reuben's used to have this brisket that was layered between 2 potato latkes and then smothered with kashkavarnishkas.
I'm very open to that.
Yeah, it's gone. Anyway.
Well, there's Mamale's now, which is like a fancy, trendy deli, which people say is really good. I've not,
So, I mean, we could have a whole conversation about Uber Eats and what it's done.
Which I've never even been able. I never lived in that era. Really, I mean, I never got DoorDash. Like when I was living in the city, you had to call a restaurant to get delivery.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that we don't have to go here, but dining out is no longer as much fun. And people's expectations of food is actually gone downhill. Going back to the Rooster, I want to share with you, my grandfather was a French-Canadian immigrant.
I have read about him in your writing.
You have, but that's a little scary because there's another piece that's coming up, and it's. I wonder what I wrote about him. But
well, you just alluded to your family growing up.
Oh, okay.
And kind of background, yeah.
Well, there's a piece that's probably going to come out about him shortly if I can ever get to it. But one of the things that won't be in it is the chicken story, and so. My grandfather was a young man who immigrated from Canada, and he was also in charge one night of holding the chicken because, and this was in the Depression, and the chicken needed to be decapitated, and he was in charge of holding the chicken. And nobody apparently had warned him, and apparently he had not observed other people killing chickens in the family, that even after the chicken's decapitated, the body still,
bops around pretty
right.
good.
Hence the phrase "chicken with its head cut off." The axe falls, the head falls, the chicken starts freaking out. My grandfather was terrified. Let's go with the chicken. The headless chicken ran under the porch where nobody could get it, and that was dinner. Nobody got to have dinner that night, and he was in such trouble as a result of that. Yeah. But I think, that isn't something that would, that reminds me of certain sort of class roots that that don't make sense to me. That like you had one shot at a protein, and now and that was it. And his whole family went hungry that night. Go ahead.
No, there's a thing with that of like, There's another kind of like, for want of a better way to put it, kind of like fancy lifestyle farm person whose work I like a lot, named Kurt Timmermeister, and he's based on Vashon Island in Washington State. But he writes about how like he self-published 2 cookbooks from his farm that are really, really fabulous. If you can ever turn up a copy, Farm Food Volume 1 and 2, and he writes in those about how like people aren't used these days. They're not used to like running out of stuff for like for the season. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of people in this country who go hungry, right? That's a routine thing, especially now with these kind of like absolutely barbaric cuts to food stamps, which is something else I wrote about in the column. It's actually the only column where I've ever not published a recipe because I was trying to highlight the fact that people had food taken out of their mouth. But you know, the like we grow all our own garlic for the season because that's fairly easy to do. And when we're out. So you I don't know if you can see this behind me. I'm working on there's a that fermentation crock right there
Yeah.
has 3 gallons of very slowly fermenting garlic scapes, the flower stem that
Yeah.
garlic sends up, which are very trendy. I actually don't super care for them personally. I think that they're fibrous, but what I'm trying to see is like how long can I store them as an experiment, right? So that like, they've been there for 3 months just hanging out. And they're gonna get fairly outrageously funky tasting, but I want to see like how effectively I can like bridge like having an alternate source of garlic flavor in the house. And like it's kind of, on one level it's kind of an indulgent silly thing, like I wouldn't deny that, but I also think that like people can, it's really extraordinary how much common knowledge we've forgotten in the last roughly 75 years about how to put things by for yourself and so to supply for yourself without trusting that the supply chain will come through. And I think what we all saw really clearly during COVID is like, well, you just can't, because the way that we've designed our supply chain is irrational beyond, and is everything to do with shareholder profit and nothing to do with, quality of life for those of us who actually eat food. And so, which I believe is all of us, hopefully. So, there's a lot of knowledge that fortunately is still held by some old people and written down and sort of scattered of like, how do you actually like square yourself away? In a way, like, I don't want to traffic in like a fantasy of like independent homestead stuff. I think that like another great podcast people could check out, the Poor Pearl's Almanac, has a whole episode about how racist that history is, among other things. But just like, I don't know, a lot of the unethical conduct that happens in our economy is a function of the fact that people don't want to have to do certain things. There are certain jobs, like cutting off a chicken's head, that a critical mass of people prefer to have outsourced because it makes them uncomfortable. But like we know this as analysts, right? Like when you have an ambivalent or kind of nasty thing that you desire, but you don't want to own your desire, and you don't want to own every step it takes to get your desire realized, you're then going to build a whole big ugly system to ward off an awareness of the thing you don't want to know about. And that's going to cause other people to suffer very reliably, but it's also going to cause you to suffer in ways that arguably are worse than if you had just like, dealt with the thing yourself. And so, my kind of, exhortation to people is like, wherever you're situated, right? Like, the more control that you can take over the basic processes that support your life, you're much more likely to act much more ethical and to cause much less damage by being willing to assume the effort and risk and discomfort for yourself.
So I was there's so much in what you just said, but I do want to go back because I was struck by something else you said. You referred to flavor and taste, and when you were talking about fermenting, and this idea of that being important, that's part of food, that's part of eating. I think that's really clear. All of your recipes make me hungry when I read them.
Oh, good. Mission accomplished.
Right? But you see, that's and that I think is a little subversive. But let me go back to something else, because you talked about the Snap article. It was really it was interesting because it is the only piece you've written that does not have a recipe, and I noticed that, and you kind of acknowledge it in the piece. But the other thing that it did was it took me back. So something you don't know about me. When I was in graduate school at Smith, my first year placement, I was down in Danbury, and I couldn't afford food. Yeah. And I remember two things. One is that a colleague of mine drove down from Boston, and we went to the grocery store, and she used her food stamps so that we could buy groceries. And then shortly thereafter, I got a volunteer position at the local food pantry in Danbury. And the deal was I would work there 2 hours a week, and I could bring home 2 bags of groceries from the food pantry. And what I learned was that you could survive on that, but not nutritiously, and it wasn't tasty. The things that we donate were appalling, and I sort of was struck by how flavor gets discounted, and how nutrition to a certain extent gets discounted for convenience.
There's a lot I want to say about the story you're telling. On my way to it, I'll just say, part of what is so violent about a society that hates poor people is that it really, really doesn't like it when poor people experience pleasure. That if you actually want being poor to be a punishment, then having a possibility of pleasure amidst that experience kind of fucks with the whole project.
Right.
And so, how often in this society do we give poor people biomass rather than food?
Yeah.
Whether they're in a jail, whether they're at my community, the college that I teach at, where I won't say that I know this to be true, but I'm given to understand that we actually have the same food plan that Aramark, the caterer, gives to the jails. And we primarily are sort of a poor, rural, working class, group of kids who can barely eat there. And you just think about a canned vegetable is sort of not a vegetable anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And there's no judgment intended in my saying that, but just to say that it's one of the many ways in which we steal dignity from poor people to force people into this position. And I think it's real striking that you and I are, this because you read the article about it, two people who are fairly well-educated professionals who had to go on food stamps within striking distance of our, graduate educations, because it was so untenable at a different moment. But the other thing I'm going to tell your audience that they're not going to know about you, and you might cut this out, but you shouldn't, is I have since then, in the flowering of your, more financially successful middle age, I have seen you do that move with other people who didn't have what they need more than once at considerable personal expense in a way that was some of the most gracious and impressive stuff I've ever seen in my life. So I'll tell you, audience members, this person pays that moment forward big time.
Well, that was unexpected. I won't cut it out. But
good.
I think, I think people that go hungry, or people that, and what's interesting was right around the time this was all happening, I was doing my graduate thesis on Jane Addams' life and work.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really thought was so fascinating about Jane Addams was at the time that she was doing the settlement movement, the things they were doing for people in immigrant communities were, arts and bringing in theater. And you could argue that this was sort of, neoliberalism. But what I found interesting was that was also a moment in history where poverty and squalor were distinct. That
Yes.
people could live in poverty but not experience squalor.
Yeah.
And there's something much more demoralizing about squalor, and the idea
Yeah.
that it has to be connected to income.
Yeah, and God, you're so right. I mean, I want to say I love the way you put that. I don't. I love the way you framed that. The reality is obviously horrible, but yeah, like I read this book recently. It is Social Worker to Social Worker. Here, I'll send you a copy of this thing if I can find it. It's a history of the poor farm movement.
Mm.
So like, a lot of people know about poor houses, the successor of the workhouse that was sort of the one size fits all social services provision system of the late 19th and early 20th century, which, as you say, were rather squalid.
Yeah.
But what a lot of people don't know about is that these also exist. Every community had to have one of these, right? It was actually not optional, because you had to have somewhere for indigent people to go. And so the poor farm was the rural solution to this, which was a self-sustaining lowercase c communist farm that was often notionally run by some kind of like Christian high virtue middle class person, but as often as not, those people were secret socialists and anarchists who ran the farm along such lines. And it was this actual extraordinary like ingathering place of like from each according to their ability to each according to their need of like people who lived in this community their whole life who knew how to farm and were then actually in a position to like often older people were teaching more able-bodied transient workers and abandoned children how to milk cows and like grow beans and like do all this kind of stuff, and they were self-provisioning. They bought virtually nothing from the outside. And you know I have thought a lot about the there's nothing that I would want to repeat about the mandatory nature of something such as that, right? But the idea of like, what liberation health people would call like a preferential option for the poor, right? Like, well, can you imagine rural public housing operating along those lines, right? Like, I think that there are a lot of people who would say that it's impossible, but like, I don't know. I live in a community that makes it really clear to me that it's not impossible. Like, we pull off extraordinary stuff all the time with no outside help. We just do it, right? And there's reasons that that is more possible here than in certain like this is a very white community, right? I'll be frank about that, but it's a community where a lot of people don't have a lot of money, and like we make shit work. And I don't know. It seems to me that if my life took another horrible turn in the way that it occasionally has, and I were to lose these things that I have, I would much rather live in that kind of situation than in the kind of public housing where I used to do home visits, which feels like designed to kill your spirit.
Yeah. Right. Like you still can, like, I know this is going to sound sappy, but you can still see a sunset, go for a walk in the woods. Like, the wonderful thing about Western Mass is there is still a connection to the land. I'm imagining this is going to come up in your book.
Yeah, I'm very, very fitfully and slowly working on a book called Field Theory, Agrarianism and Analysis, that touches on a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today, including the idea of like, our drive for food, our relationship for food is with food, is not actually cognized as being about food in psychoanalytic theory, right? So we have people like Melanie Klein who like recognize that like what people do when they like nurse or chest feed is that they're like feeding a baby with their body, but like they quickly run away from the food fact of that, right? Like, and none of our mainstream theories of human motivation, pleasure, growth, in psychoanalysis actually countenance food at all, except as a symbol. But the thing when you haven't had enough food is that it is a symbol and it's not.
Yep.
And so part of the kind of aim of that book is to think through like, well, what would what would a psychoanalytic theory look like that took seriously that essentially all of human life is about food production?
Hmm. And food pleasure.
Yeah.
And for years I've maintained this, and you can fight me on it, but
No.
I think food is more important than sex because I can't tell you how many times after I've had good sex I want to eat,
Yep.
as opposed to when I've had a good meal I don't want to have sex. Like,
No.
it's and that
No, not
I think that's important.
Mhm.
I know that you've been really generous with our time, and we're sort of running towards the end of it. But I did want to ask you,
Yeah.
because some of the role of
Here, I'm
this.
just gonna. I don't mean to interrupt you. For the purposes of your recording, I'm just gonna tell this other person that I'm running 5 minutes late.
Okay.
And then we can. Um, this is a chunky cut. I apologize.
No problem.
Okay.
It's not a
You were
problem.
saying.
So
Okay.
you've talked a lot about, I think, and you've connected a lot about how, the idea of pleasure and taste and sensation and food and writing about food all has elements of subversion. What advice would you give our psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic, social justice listeners who want to cultivate some playful subversions in their own lives, but get stuck or feel guilty about doing it? Like,
Yeah.
what would you say?
Everyone who we venerate as like OG analysts and activists were freaks. They were really deeply weird, lascivious, unspun human beings, right? And like a lot of them were very into fairly avant-garde sexual liberation beliefs and practices. There were more than one orgy enthusiast among the early psychoanalysts, like documented in writing. So like, if tradition matters to you, like, well, that's the tradition. I don't really care, but it is the tradition. Um, you know, I have an article coming out sometime next year called "Psychoanalysis is Bad for You." That's basically about like, I it's just an overtaxing use of your mirror neurons to do this kind of empathy all day, every day, and to tolerate like the slings and arrows of transference and countertransference all day, every day. Like we just have enough data to know that like that is rough on your nervous system in a way that takes a toll. And from my perspective, like y- if you're gonna do this kind of work, like you'd better find a mean whatever being a slut means to you, you got to find a way to be a slut because it's gonna kill you otherwise. Like we're part of the sacrifice that we make for other people is that we do something that is bad for our bodies and minds to be of service to others. We sit still and take in emotional poison for hours and hours on end, and then it's over, and then we can't talk to the people we love about it. And that is a real burden to bear, I think, that we don't talk about enough in those terms. But like if you're gonna be bearing that burden, like you better be sucking the fucking marrow out of life every other hour that's available to you, or you're gonna crack.
We didn't get to talk about bone marrow. I love bone
Oh,
marrow. Oh my gosh.
yeah.
And so Carter, thank you so much for this. This was
Thank you.
I don't know if I told you this was my first episode. So
I know. I'm so honored and feel coquettish about that. Yeah.
I love it. So for those of you that are viewing, Carter's been a very generous guest, and we're both doing this for fun and for free. But there are a few ways you can acknowledge our labors. You can follow our Substacks. Carter's
Thank you.
is Psychoanalyst, aka at Carter J. Carter. And mine is Gamer Therapist, aka at Mike Langlois. And we have free versions, and we also like getting paid as well. And we're not ashamed to say that. However, you can also donate to any of the nonprofits that Carter gave me. And the links are going to appear momentarily when the podcast is finishing up. And the ones that you gave me were the Hilltown Church's Food Pantry,
Yeah, I can tell you all about these if you want to.
Yeah, what can you tell me about the three that you did before?
Totally. So the Hilltown Church's food pantry is the food pantry in my hometown,
Okay.
which has seen a huge escalation of need, because this is, I live in Franklin County, which is actually the poorest county in Massachusetts.
Yep.
And rural folks out here are having a really hard time with economics being what they are. So the Hilltown Food Pantry is amazing, and it is a far more dignified experience for people, for our neighbors, than the one that you unfortunately had to tolerate. And so I think that they do a really amazing job. But the other two, uh, people people in the kind of like lefty circles that we inhabit probably hear the phrase land back a lot, and don't necessarily have a mental model of what that looks like. But these other two organizations give a clear pathway for that. So the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust is literally raising money to buy agricultural land for Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color, to what they call rematriate a lot of that land, particularly into the indigenous people and the descendants of enslaved people. So they're doing that in a part of the country with enormously high food costs, and that also is very, very predominantly white in its rural areas. So I cannot say enough good things about the work that they do. I really admire them very much. And then the other one is called Nuestras Raíces, which is in a city about an hour from me called Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is, I believe, the most Puerto Rican municipality outside of the island of Puerto Rico. And it's also a place that is stunning and fabulous and full of very, very delicious food. My wife works there now, so I'm fortunate that I get to go visit a lot. But it's also a place that's been really, really beset by structural violence and food insecurity, and is a place where, until this organization was started, a lot of the like Puerto Rican folks who would come up from the island had spent their lives as farmers, and they were now living in like a kind of brick and concrete environment where they didn't have anywhere to grow food. And so this is a farm organization that basically lets people who grew up as rural kind of like campesino farmers to like mobilize their agricultural knowledge, both to grow food for themselves, to sell, to teach people how to do it in the next generation. And they're just extraordinary. And really any of these would be very worthy of your support.
Well, I shared the screen for all three of those, and Carter, if you ever run out of ideas for a food column, mofongo.
Mofongo.
We need.
You want mofongo? Go to La Isla in Holyoke, Massachusetts, if you're ever driving through.
You know what? Maybe next year. I make an annual pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Carter, everyone. Thank you, Carter, very much for your time. I'm going to release you back to your family, and I really appreciate your generosity.
They will object, but thank you very much.
Night.
Okay, I'll see you all.
Bye.
See ya.